Hi, my name is Jack Lonergan, and my presentation for PACS 3 is on the scientist Galileo Galilei, who is known as the father of modern science. So I primarily want to discuss a single ethical dilemma that Galileo faced, and I don't want to make this too much like a biography, but there are still some basic facts just to understand him a little bit as a person. So Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy on February 15th, 1564, and he was the oldest of 6 children to his parents Vincenzo and Julia Galilei. Now, as his family was not the richest of families, they were rather poor, and 2 of his siblings ended up dying in childbirth. So he technically has 6 children, or 6 siblings, but not all of them survived. His father wanted Galileo to go into a high-paying job, given that he was considered like the oldest son, and they wanted him to be able to act as a provider. So his father, throughout his elementary education up through university level, kind of shielded him from certain subjects such as mathematics and philosophy, because these were not very high-paying areas of study. And instead, his father strongly encouraged him to go into medicine. So when he ended up attending the University of Pisa, he went to go to med school, essentially. However, once he got there, he kind of realized that he had an interest in math by sitting in on a few lectures, and out of his own self-interest, despite that he couldn't provide financially as much as he would have been able to with med school, he said, "I want to study mathematics and philosophy." Now, his father wasn't totally on board with the idea, but he reluctantly agreed. So Galileo went on to study mathematics and philosophy and ended up becoming a professor of the subject. The reason that he didn't go to school for science, because some people might be wondering, well, he had all these scientific discoveries, made so many contributions to science, was simply because science wasn't a thing yet. The best tools that society had for understanding reality was the logical arguments put forward by philosophers, and then religion also played a major part, specifically where he was living in Italy, the Roman Catholic Church. So the reason he didn't go to school for science was because science simply wasn't a thing at that point in history. As he grew older, he ended up meeting a woman named Marina Gamba, and although he never married Marina, he had his own personal desires that kind of got in the way of being married, and he had 3 children with her as a result of it, out of wedlock. Their names were Virginia, Livia, and also Vincenzo. Now, because these children were born out of wedlock, they were considered at the time illegitimate children and unmarriable. So we see that although Galileo is known as more of an academic figure, that even in his personal life, a lot of his decisions that he makes are more for himself and his own desires, even if they hurt members of his family. Sort of to make up for this, but not really, he wanted to relieve the financial burden of his family, probably in part because he decided to go into mathematics and philosophy rather than a higher paying field such as medicine. He wanted to not feel the financial burden of taking care of 3 children. So for his 2 oldest children, Virginia and Livia, he essentially gave them away to the church when they were just young girls, I think both younger than the age of 10. And he basically told them or the church told them that they're going to become nuns and live as nuns for the rest of their lives. So Galileo constantly is when making even basic, I shouldn't say basic, but not incredibly major moral decisions. If you look at his life as a whole, we still see that he's constantly prioritizing himself and his own values and desires over maybe what his family financially needs or what his children want. And lastly, Galileo is a devout Catholic, which is somewhat ironic because he spends his entire life fighting against the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of people have a misconception of Galileo, saying, oh, well, he's fighting against the church, he didn't believe in God, whatever. That's not true. He was a strong believer in the Judeo-Christian God, but he just had a different viewpoint than the Catholic Church. Now, before I go into Galileo's main dilemma that I want to discuss, his main ethical issue that he faces, I think it's important to also discuss the Roman Catholic Church during Galileo's time period, partially because it's very different than the Catholic Church today, and partially just to give some context to know their perspective during this time. So Galileo grew up in the Protestant Reformation, and there are two main branches of Christianity. There's Catholicism and there's Protestantism. Now, Catholicism was the main branch of Christianity that was in power, which is why they had the Roman Catholic Church. But the other branch, Protestantism, was gaining more ground. So Catholicism, trying to hold on to the power that it already had, was taking extreme measures to make sure that people followed along with the doctrine that they were preaching. And anybody that kind of disagreed with the Catholic Church, they would call them a heretic, and they could be punished by either exile, torture, or death. One more very key issue that will play a huge part in Galileo's dilemma later on is that the church believed in geocentrism. Now, geocentrism is the theory that the Earth is the center of the universe, and everything else out that we see in the solar system, we look out the night sky, such as stars, other planets, our sun and the moon, it says that all of those objects orbit around Earth. Now, Galileo, on the other hand, had heard of Copernicus's theory called heliocentrism. And heliocentrism is the idea that the sun is the center of the universe, or as we now know as the solar system, and that all the planets and moons end up orbiting around the sun, including our own planet Earth. But this is the mindset that the Catholic Church has at this point. They're very desperate to hold on to power, and this is one of the predominant theories that they believe in. So Galileo basically challenging this theory, knowing that he could potentially be exiled, tortured, or put to death, gives a little better context for the circumstances that he's facing. So throughout Galileo's life, he gathers evidence for Copernicus's theory of heliocentrism. Primarily, he was one of the first people to look through a telescope and pointed towards the night sky, and you notice that Jupiter had moons. And somebody might say, well, why does this show that heliocentrism is correct rather than geocentrism? Geocentrism says that all objects orbit around Earth. So if Jupiter has moons, that means objects are orbiting around some celestial body that is other than Earth. And that was what the Catholic Church was not preaching. So this was a big deal for him, that he was able to discover the moons of Jupiter. And then he actually drew this little diagram right here showing that the positions, those big circles, Jupiter, and these little asterisks are his moons. And he's showing that the positions of them each night are changing, which is showing the orbit. the moons. He also noticed that the planet Venus, if you looked at it through a telescope each night, you would see a different portion of the planet. And that it almost had certain phases, like the moon does. The fact that Venus had phases indicated that it was orbiting around the sun as well. So Galileo found out about the moons of Jupiter. He noticed that Venus had phases just like the moon did. And then he also provided really an incredible argument for Earth's static nature. Because at the time, the Catholic Church was saying, well, Earth is the center of the universe, and it's not moving because when we look at the ground, it doesn't move. If it was moving, how come stuff's not flying off the shelves, and how come we don't feel it? And there's a really good video that explains it well in Galilean terms. Isaac Newton ended up coming up with this theory a little bit later, and this related to his first law of motion, but this video explains it more of how Galileo conceptualized it.
The idea. For him, the suggestion that the moon could influence events on Earth smacked of astrology. So he devised an intriguing thought experiment. He used a horse to represent the motion of the Earth. If a rider dropped a ball while standing still, the ball would, of course, fall straight down, landing beside the horse. But what would happen if the same rider dropped the ball with the horse at full gallop? In Galileo's experiment, the forward motion of the horse would be communicated to the ball through the rider's hand. As the ball dropped, it would continue to move forward and would still land beside the horse, just as it had done when the horse stood still. To Galileo, when the horse and the ball shared the same motion, it was as if the motion did not exist. If the Earth were moving, could we be carried along with it and not be conscious of its motion? There is
Okay, so Galileo makes a lot of discoveries for the theory of heliocentrism, and he's attempted to present these results to the Catholic Church before, and they essentially told him that no, you cannot do this, and you're not allowed to teach or research on heliocentrism. Yet, due to his own personal interests, which we see as a recurring pattern in his life, he decides to do it anyway. And at the age of 70 years old, this is rather old for somebody living during that time period. He's getting older and his health is declining. He attempts to go to the Roman Catholic Church for one final time in his life to present the theory of heliocentrism, to try to convince the Catholic Church essentially that they're wrong. It's a large task to do, especially at his old age. And he has a clever approach where he puts the argument in the form of a literary book called dialogue. And dialogue is, well, a dialogue between two people. One of them is clearly arguing for heliocentrism, and one of them is arguing for geocentrism. Now, Galileo thought this would be a successful method of integrating heliocentrism into the Roman Catholic Church, because in this book he was not presenting heliocentrism as fact, merely just as a theory. And in the book he claims that geocentrism was the winning theory, even though if you actually read the book, you would clearly see that's not the case. He's saying that, though, just to please the Roman Catholics. And this plan honestly would have worked, except his plan was slightly foiled because